Perfect. Thanks, Anand, for the presentation. So I would like to move to our last but not least speaker, Professor Molly Anderson, who is a well-known academic and expert from the US, known for her work in food policy, with a focus on issues like food system sustainability, food justice, food systems resilience. Currently, she directs the academic program in food studies in Middlebury College in Vermont, in the US. She is also an advisory member of the FEAST project. She's currently involved in food system reform and planning at the local, state, and regional scales. She participates in the Regional Food Solutions New England Network and the National Interinstitutional Network for Food, Agriculture, and Sustainability. She's also a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. And she has also worked as a private consultant for domestic and international organizations like Oxfam America and Tufts University, among other outstanding contributions that she has done throughout her career. And she will present to us alternative approaches to food systems and what is needed for the food systems so that they can ensure food security, but also while protecting the environment and promoting health and well-being. So I would now like Molly to pass the word to you, and thank you for accepting the invitation and meet here. Molly, are you here?
Yes, I am. And thank you, Sofia, for that introduction. I was having trouble unmuting myself for just a minute. And thank you to FEAST for inviting me to share in this policy chat. I really appreciated the way that both Tim and Anant set the stage. Tim talking about the threats to the food system, and Anant talking about really dissecting the Draghi report and telling us what we can build on in the Draghi report and then what we need to fight against it. In contrast to their presentations, I have a very simple presentation that focuses on vision, because I think to a large extent we have lost our vision of what's really needed. What I'm showing in this first slide are two visions from the Great Transitions Initiative. And of course, many people have set up scenarios of the future and tried to say, well, if we continue on the path we're on, here's what's going to happen. If we adopt different policies, here's what could happen. The top picture of eco-communalism is very similar to the vision that I would like to see, and the bottom of Fortress World. And Fortress World pops up in almost every scenario. Fortress World is where the United States is moving right now, and it's a very grim protectionist view of America first. They don't seem to understand that America first was used by the people who supported Nazism in World War II originally. They think they've come up with it originally. As Sofia mentioned, I'm from the United States. We share many of the EU's problems, but with our own in addition, especially since the November election and the January 20th inauguration of Donald Trump. We don't invest or innovate enough in the food system, and innovation is a complex term. We need to pull that apart and be thinking about innovation for whom and for what. That's something that IPES Food is working on right now, and we'll have a report coming out about that fairly soon. We have a rapidly aging population. Farmers are rapidly aging, and of course, climate change will wreak havoc in the United States, as in the EU and everywhere. Civil society in the United States is being ignored and not consulted on governmental issues. Some of the things that are different in the United States from the EU, first, now we have a narcissistic sociopath in control who's pushing back on all progressive legislation and partnerships, such as by withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement and from the World Health Organization, and telling government public health officials that they can't say anything about bird flu, as if by not saying anything about it, it will go away. Totally crazy. We have rampant, unchecked disinformation in the United States, exacerbated by Fox News, our lack of independent media, and the decision by Mark Zuckerberg to stop fact-checking X. The US public, which had already been dulled by far right-wing propaganda, has even more trouble now discerning truth from lies. We're also seeing a clear shift to oligarchy, with a small group of obscenely wealthy men bent on acquiring even more wealth and power, while the poorest people's spending power hasn't budged since the 1970s. And that group of obscenely wealthy men were seated right behind Donald Trump at his inauguration, which gave a clear visual of where we're going in the United States. And finally, some of the recent developments: the United States is abnegating from foreign aid, except emergency food assistance to our friends and military supplies to Israel. The likely impacts of these policies on our own food system and globally that are food systems under stress are truly dire. A very high proportion of work in the United States in fields, meatpacking plants, distribution, retail, and restaurants is performed by undocumented workers or quote unquote migrants in irregular situations, as the International Office for Migration now refers to them. The Trump administration has targeted these people for deportation as scapegoats, although they are truly an asset to the US food system and to US society. And because they're an asset, they will surely be brought back through other means, despite this deportation that's happening now, because US citizens are not going to do the very difficult work in the food system that they have been doing. So under these circumstances, the question of what our food system and what our society should look like becomes ever more urgent. Whether we will be moving toward something like eco-communalism or continuing along this path toward a fortress society. Over the past few years, I have been analyzing narratives, or how people talk about the food system, how they talk about what they want. And it's become apparent to me that we have two meta-narratives in food systems that are competing with each other. One is this meta-narrative of extractive, industrialized food systems, in which food is a commodity to be produced and distributed solely for profit. And the other is a regenerative vision, a regenerative food system in which food is a public good with multiple values, and the production, distribution, and consumption of food are embedded within human rights. So I'll be talking more about this regenerative food system, and here's a little more about what I mean by this. In a regenerative food system, food holds multiple values. In an extractive food system, food is primarily a means of acquiring profits. And this goes back to what Anat was talking about, that these billionaires have become even more wealthy at a time that more and more people have been pushed into desperate situations of food insecurity. Second, that food security and resources need to produce food as public goods, belonging in the commons for the benefit of everyone, versus this view of food as a commodity like any other commodity that belongs to the wealthiest people. The third is that food is everyone's right. versus food should go to people who have the means to pay for it, wealthy people, in societies that can afford to bring that food to make it accessible to wealthy people. Fourth, that nature exists in its own right and must be respected and restored. And this is part of what Anat was talking about, versus the view that nature is here solely for human exploitation. The last element here is that care and reciprocity are essential elements of food systems. These are part of the regenerative vision of food systems. Care and reciprocity have no place whatsoever in the extractive food system. So I'm going to leave that up and talk about a little bit more about what I see in the Draghi report and this push toward competitiveness. I see competition as an attempt to boost a failed and failing position. Despite the fact that there's much that's good in the Draghi report, this emphasis on competitiveness prioritizes the productivity of the industrialized system, concentration of agribusiness, exports by companies. This is a position that will only become weaker if the Trump administration imposes the tariffs that it's been threatening. The omnibus bill to loosen regulations on business is headed in exactly the wrong direction. Business should be supporting the public interest, not adding more profits to company coffers. Food and finance companies recently have been pulling back from their climate commitments. Many of these were always a smokescreen. They were just a way to convince shareholders that these big food and beverage businesses were doing the right thing. But making the world habitable requires these climate commitments to be strengthened and to be closely monitored for compliance. It requires that subsidies on fossil fuels and further extraction be eliminated. In contrast to the increased competitiveness vision, we need food systems that are based in this view of regeneration, food systems that regenerate communities and the natural environment, and that stop extraction from communities and from nature. And when I talk about extraction from communities, that's what has been happening increasingly with the massive migration from the global north to from the global south. We are stripping communities of the people they need to be creating regenerative communities where they come from. We've also been extracting from nature increasingly. And even the renewable vision of the Green New Deal is stripping from nature to provide critical minerals that are needed for renewable technology. So we need to get around that. Regenerative food systems work within a framework of human rights, which encompasses everything. They include decent work in healthy conditions. In addition, a regenerative food system means ecological integrity, widespread democratic participation, which Tim talked about extensively. What that means: land redistribution to provide access to land and the necessary resources for food production, increasing agroecological systems instead of these extractive industrialized systems. And all of this happening with solidarity with food systems in other regions that respect and support these fundamental pillars of a decent society. Instead of trying to be more competitive with other economies, we need to invest in a care society, a care economy that supports our own. This is really, I think, the only alternative to tariffs and increasing competitiveness across societies. We need increased investment in workers, including the women who backstop the formal economy by performing invisible, unpaid care to their families. this is the only thing that has made these formal economies possible. Supporting our own also entails short supply chains, closer connections between producers and end consumers, support for small and mid-sized businesses that serve their local communities first, and greater attention to serving the need for access to healthy food for all from local sources. So here I'm totally in agreement with the basic, the fundamental ideals of FEAST. We need a food system that's premised on food for all, that's premised on degrowth or shrinking businesses that degrade the environment and destroy public health, while growing the businesses that invest in the public interest. So that's why I'm showing in this diagram that food movements need to collaborate with other movements that are pushing degrowth, pushing ecological integrity and the restoration of nature, and also pushing equity, pushing back against this growing inequality, both within and across societies. So food movements need to be collaborating and cooperating with other movements that are building these other aims. The linchpins of a regenerative food system, food sovereignty, agroecology, land and resource distribution to marginalized people, and a just transition. I'm showing those here as the things that happen in the interstices between these movements. A public narrative of regeneration, care, and cooperation rather than competitiveness will hold these movements together. The kind of food system that I'm describing is not just a pipe dream. It's consistent with UNDROP, the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Peasants and Other People Living in Rural Societies that was recently approved by the General Assembly. It's consistent with the ILO's Decent Work Guidelines. It's consistent with the Green New Deal and with food sovereignty principles as they have been articulated by civil society, and the substantial work that's been done on elaborating human rights for all, including the right to food and the Global Compact on Migration. So I'm not the only person dreaming about this regenerative food system. Retreating from these agreements and goals and retreating from corporate responsibility, as this omnibus bill does, is a huge step backwards. As we imagine competitiveness, it should be competition toward the greatest well-being for the population as a whole, as a not stressed, and for the poorest people in that population. It should be competitiveness in restoring ecological integrity, in protecting human rights, and inclusion of all members in society in participating in decision-making. So we in the United States, as we are looking at retreat from many of these goals, are really looking toward the EU to be upholding these goals and values. Each society faces the choice of whether it will become meaner, uglier, and more myopic in its vision, or whether it will choose a path of greater freedom, compassion, and integrity, whether it focuses on building higher walls or making longer tables where more people can be fed. The United States has clearly made the choice toward meanness, ugliness, and higher walls, but the current response of the EU is still hanging in the balance. And I really hope that you will choose the right kind of competitiveness. And that's what I have to offer you today. I welcome your questions and really appreciated the contributions from Tim and Anant that laid the groundwork for what I had to say.
Thank you, Molly, for your presentation. I would like to rescue one question that was pop up just a little earlier on, and there was a question on optimal scale of regional self-sufficiency in foods. I don't know if any of the speakers would like to elaborate on that.
Well, I can start, and I'm sure others will have a view. Do we still have Tim with us? I know that he needed to move
No,
to leave early.
unfortunately, unfortunately, he had to leave, so he's no longer with us. But Yanan is still here.
Anant would have things to say about that too. But what I am envisioning is a much more decentralized society. And I really think that we will have to move back to a much more rural society to grow these rural areas that have been depopulated recently, both in the United States and in Europe, because the push toward urbanization is completely dependent on the way that we have become dependent on fossil fuels for everything. And as we have to move away from fossil fuels, renewable fuels cannot substitute to the same level as fossil fuels have. So we'll have to scale back. That's part of degrowth and part of a movement back toward more rural societies where people are much more dependent on each other, much more dependent on local and regional communities, and on stronger ties between producers and consumers. So Anant, what do you think about that?
Yeah, in terms of like a population size, maybe two nuanced things on this. One is just, I think there also needs to be a reconceptualization of land use and land ownership. And this we saw in the Feast project, where there was a very inspirational small farmer from Portugal who, does regenerative farming and all organic, et cetera, but she doesn't own her own land, and she's, I think, farmed that land for like 11 or 12 years, and she's on a year-to-year lease. And we asked her what were her views on the farmer protests in Europe and whether she participated, and she said that she doesn't have time for that because she's working 6 days a week, 10 to 11 hours per day. So, if we wanted these smaller communities taking charge of their food systems, I think we need to kind of desperately reevaluate how we're distributing land and looking at land ownership versus a commons, for example. My interpretation, Sofia, of that question, is it, or maybe your interpretation as well, and Molly or Samuele, like what population size? Should it be like 5,000 people or 10,000 people? I honestly don't know. I don't have enough background in this to know what an ideal catchment area would be. One thing I could just bring to the table is just looking at healthcare. So GP practices and primary care practices usually have a catchment area of between 5,000 to 6,000 people. Sometimes there'll be about 3,000. So I don't know if that's like sort of an ideal catchment population size where it's big enough. It's sort of like the Goldilocks principle, where it's big enough that it's diverse and you have the different functions that you need, but it's small enough that they can kind of get together as a community and make decisions. But I don't know what the ideal population size would be, or even geographic sort of catchment area should be. How many hectares or square meters of space should we kind of allocate to these kind of micro or meso food systems? I don't know if you guys have thoughts on this, or maybe work has been done in this area. I'm just ignorant, so I don't know.
I think that's a really good answer, Anant. And I don't know either, but I think it will become clear what's the ideal size of a community. It needs to be a community that allows decision making, but that can be done in many ways. It can be done in a nested way of having neighborhood food policy councils that feed into a larger food policy council, a little bit like the Conselho system in Brazil, which happily has been restored. So I'm not sure. There's a recent IPES food report called Land Squeeze that I want to refer you to. And I feel like I'm always hawking IPES food reports because I really admire the work that the rest of the panel has done. I didn't work very much on this particular report, but it's talking about the need for land redistribution on a massive scale in every country, because land access has become so concentrated, and the people who are growing healthy food can't get land anymore. It's one of the biggest barriers to land. So Samuele or others, if you would like to pitch in.
Well, no, thank you so much, Molly. I think that given the time, we can actually start closing the webinar. And well, but thank you so much, Molly. Thank you so much, Anant, and thank you also to Tim and also to Sofia for the amazing moderation of the event. It was really the richness of information we all received was really almost overwhelming, and I'm sure that when we will share the recording, everyone will be more than glad to go back to these debates. And I just wanted to go back a little bit to one aspect I mentioned in the introduction, and is that, and this was really also in your final presentation, Molly, is who gets to decide what we discuss about. And so this is really a fundamental question, and this is what we try to do today. And it's I go back to also now almost 40 years ago. It's the philosopher called Hans Jonas wrote this famous book called The Imperative of Responsibility, where the core message was that current generation had a moral imperative to preserve life for the future ones. And so I think that today what we wanted to stress, it's this aspect of sort of we want to discuss about these topics. So what you presented, there are different views, different vision. How do you, many in the chat said, yes, this is interesting, but how do we get there? How do we realize a food democracy, for example? Which is the right balance? Which is the right proportion of the community we are proposing? But this is already a step ahead, because we are already discussing about these aspects. And so I think that a key message that I really want, and why I really wanted to have this webinar, is that it doesn't matter where each of us are working, and especially for the participants, I think that we all have a moral imperative, especially in this moment, not to surrender our agendas to this aspect of the competitiveness framework. We have a moral imperative to put health, to put public health, to put sustainability, regenerative system back in the agenda. And if we let these disappear from the agenda, then the future generations, what we are proposing, then will not be the ones that we are all aiming for, we want to have. So it's really this aspect of do not surrender to this agenda and put these aspects back, and please try to discuss as much as possible. And so thank you so much again for to everyone who participated, to all the speakers, because I think that we achieved this, and we can continue further, and we can try to share our responsibility back in our work and in our communities.